Thank you to all the organizers for putting the symposium together and for inviting me. It's been a bunch of really interesting talks so far today, and I'm also really excited to have the opportunity to come here and share with all of you what my group has been working on for the past several years. So just very brief introduction. My name is Lejeune, and I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. This photo shows my research group last year, so Hiba, Jeffrey, Saeed, Kwan, Irfan, Sarah, and Lingzhao. And the work that I'm going to be presenting today, all of them have contributed to in various different ways, so I just wanted to point them out at the beginning. And I haven't met most people in this room. My group does work kind of across all of these keywords here, but really, I think sort of the scientific question that kind of keeps me up at night, and is what I'm going to be talking about today, is this idea, how do we know when a method is effective, generalizable, and reproducible? I love methods, and I think about this all the time. And I think about this a lot when I work with collaborators over in biomedical engineering. So we have collaborators who have developed incredible technology to basically grow engineered heart tissue from patient-specific cells, and they want to understand what experimental protocols will allow us to grow the most mature and most functional heart tissue. And sort of answering that question, what method is best, is quite challenging. And then, related to what a ton of people in this room think about, right? This is also super relevant in applying machine learning techniques to problems in mechanics, right? And this is a challenge for two populations of people. The first population is people who say, hey, I have this application domain or this problem I want to solve. I don't really care what method I use. I just want it to work. They might look out into the literature and not necessarily know what the right method to pick up is, right? But it's also limiting for people like, a lot of the people in this room, where they're really excited about methods development. And if you develop a new method, it's really hard to be able to actually show, hey, my method actually performs better than what else is out there, right? So with this kind of central kind of question in mind, and maybe these notions of application areas, so tissue engineering and machine learning and things like that, really sort of the thing that I want to talk to you all about is this idea right here. So basically, we need thoughtfully designed benchmarks that make our claims testable, our methods comparable, and our results reproducible. And this table here kind of shows some of the subtleties of creating benchmarks and some of the things that go into it. And these movies right here show sort of examples of some of the stuff that my group has been working on in cardiac tissue engineering, and then more recently thinking about some more complicated problems in mechanics with a lot of nonlinearity in them. But really, the point of this slide is essentially there's a whole world out there that goes into sort of thinking of thoughtful benchmarks, and it's not something that I feel like I've solved, but it is what I want to talk about today, and have interesting follow-up conversations with people afterwards. So in this talk, we already made it through the introduction. I'm going to start by telling you all about what I call kind of the development of naive benchmarks. So mechanical MNIST, so that's some work that I've done since 2020 and worked on mostly from 2020 to 2023. I want to talk a little bit about promoting open science in the mechanics community and how that kind of ties into this picture of doing reproducible work. And then I want to tell you all a little bit about some of my ongoing work in developing more sophisticated benchmarks that kind of are designed to sort of inspire the types of things that Manuel sort of pointed to with his last question. What are the next challenges that people should potentially be thinking about in this space? So without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. So basically, in 2020, when I started my lab, it's the year I created this slide, and I kind of include this slide just sort of as is. You can see all of these dates. The most recent publication is 2020, almost as kind of like an interesting artifact. Because at that point in time, you could go to a conference and sit in a bunch of talks that were all kind of focused on this concept that I don't necessarily need to describe here, right? But this idea of creating meta models of heterogeneous materials, all sorts of reasons why that could be important and impactful. But this is sort of setting the stage for what I was thinking about when I got into this research area. So I was looking at this kind of field and sort of returning to that central question that, I guess metaphorically, but also sometimes literally keeps me up at night. How do we know if our methods really work? And thought about sort of implementing a really simple benchmark and sharing it with the broader community. And that's kind of summarized right here. So from 2020, this is the mechanical MNIST simulation version. And it's relatively simple. The idea is basically we take the MNIST patterns from computer vision, we convert those into finite element analysis simulations, all run in Phoenix, so all of the code is online and open access alongside the datasets. We apply some deformation, and then we can record things like full field displacements, change in strain energy, force displacement curves, things like that. And the reason why we were so kind of inspired by the MNIST dataset is because there's kind of good reasons why it's popular in the computer vision research community. I think sort of the biggest reason is that it's just a really nice size for getting started with things. It's large enough that you can train a convolutional neural network or some complex neural network on it. But it's also small enough that you can download it on your computer before I move on to the next slide. So it's just very accessible at people's fingertips. And we're trying to create sort of an analogy of that for the mechanics research community. So that is what we sort of started with. And then driven by a bunch of different questions that we were interested in and kind of like papers that we kind of wanted to write and questions we wanted to look at. We expanded this initial data set to include multiple load cases, include different input patterns, add different simulation fidelities, and then also include some more things like, for example, full field damage. And basically, we were sort of fleshing out this set of computational data sets, while at the same time doing some machine learning methods development. And I have a couple of snapshots that I want to share with you all. But I think the thing that we're kind of really excited about as a group is sort of the creation and dissemination of this data and the creation and dissemination of all of the code, both for creating the simulations and also for re-implementing any of our machine learning techniques, so that if you're looking at the methods I'm going to present on the next couple of slides and thinking, wow, I have a way better idea, it should actually be relatively easy. I say that, and then if you run into issues, email me and I can help you. But it should be relatively easy to basically reproduce the work that we've done and show that an alternative method is better or different in some way. So here's just kind of like one snapshot of some of what we did with our early work. My student, Saeed, was looking at this problem of just full field prediction. And we were relatively unimpressed with how UNets were doing. He tried and implemented a UNet, and it didn't do that well. And we said, OK, can we come up with a different machine learning model architecture that will do better? And he basically came up with this kind of Frankenstein model that we call a multi-resolution WNet. And in a very hand-wavy way, maybe it sort of does a better job of connecting boundary conditions to what's going on inside the domain. But also, I don't actually really know why it performs better. But the idea is basically we came up with a model architecture that does better than a UNet, and then also published the data set and the code alongside it, so you could reproduce this and try to exceed that performance. So this slide right here, two histograms, frequency percentage on the Y, and then absolute percentage error on the X. And you can look at the performance of the UNet with an average error of 4.51, and the performance of our proposed model with an average error of 1.14. You can see they look better. And then also, we've plotted the 4 worst examples from each test data set. And the red X's and the gray X's should perfectly overlap if everything's perfect. And you can see there's a much bigger discrepancy in sort of the baseline, and we're able to implement something better. Another kind of brief snapshot of the work that my group has been doing is shown sort of on this slide. We got really interested in sort of 2 things. The first thing is this thing that if you read a computer science paper, a certain type of computer science paper, they'll perform these really large computational experiments, right? So they'll draw from multiple data sets and apply their methods across multiple data sets. And they're working with these not particularly interpretable methods, but they're able to sort of do a better job of demonstrating the efficacy and robustness of these methods by applying them across multiple data sets and performing just a genuinely very large suite of computational experiments. And so we're really interested in sort of doing something similar, but focused exclusively on mechanics data. So in addition to the mechanical MNIST work, we have a couple of other data sets that my group has published. We have the buckling instability classification data set, where we basically have these heterogeneous columns under compression, and under a certain load, they're stable or unstable. So it's just a simple classification problem. And then we also have these kind of columns here that we also compress, but these have complex architecture, so they're best captured by some graph or graph neural network combined with a graph structure approach. And again, classification problem, are these structures going to bend left or bend right under load? And then from our mechanical MNIST collection, we have this full field damage thing, which we can discretize a pixel as damaged or undamaged. So we essentially have 3 classification problems, and we can do something like just sort of explore a bunch of different kind of standard approaches to assessing model calibration. And we can do that with these data sets at a much larger scale than what is typically done in the sort of machine learning meets mechanics literature. So I don't want to dwell too long on this slide, but the basic idea is we have 3 main data sets, BIC and the ABC data set. Both have kind of 3 sub-data sets within them. This one uses just really simple feed-forward neural networks. This one uses graph neural networks. For this one, I believe we actually implemented a UNet, or some convolutional neural network. And we can put together these large plots. On the x-axis, you have expected calibration error. On the y-axis, you have error. You want to be down in the lower green corner. And basically, the conclusions that we're able to draw from this are relatively simple. We're able to see what methods worked, but we're excited about this project because we're able to do things just kind of at a much larger scale than, at least to us, what feels typical in the kind of machine learning mechanics mashup literature. So that's kind of the story of what we've been doing with the mechanical MNIST data set. And I would say that's sort of like 2020 to 2023-ish. Over the past kind of 5 years as well, the other thing we've gotten extremely excited about is this idea here of promoting open science in the mechanics community. I think definitely from sort of working with this idea of pushing benchmarks and all of those things, we really sort of realized that this is something that's much, much bigger than what one lab can do alone. And so our thoughts are basically like, okay, someone might use our data set, but then they actually are interested in like a specific problem that goes beyond the scope of what we can do. Or maybe they're implementing something with experimental data beyond the scope of what a computational lab does. And we just got sort of very invested in sort of thinking about what open science best practices are and how to sort of have more of these discussions with the community. I think that open science in the mechanics community is something that people are getting more and more excited about. And I think one thing that is really kind of exciting about like this moment right now, especially if you're like a PhD student or starting out a lab, is that there's a lot of conversations going on about what best practices actually are. Like, are you going to sort of share, your data set? Are you going to share your code? Are you going to share your paper? How do you sort of get all the information that goes into making a paper out there in the world? And there's all sorts of cool things going on right now with, knowledge graphs and large language models and stuff like that. And this is just a conversation that I'd like to have with anyone who's interested. So I have a slide here. On our end, we've talked a lot with the BU libraries. We're really fortunate to have some really kind of smart colleagues over in libraries. And they've taught us a lot about sort of what metadata to include, information about different types of data storage. And then we've also had the opportunity to work with them to do some advocacy within our university for having sort of better data storage and data dissemination tools. The University of Texas system is actually way better than the Boston University system. And it's something that I encourage everyone to just Google like your university and institutional repository. Yeah, Manuel uses the Texas Dataverse, which is awesome. Yeah, so that's just one thing. And then we've also had the chance to do some community engagement that I wanted to share with you all as well. The first link is to a blog post on the website iMechanica that is just sort of everything I just said, but written out much better. And we got some really nice comments there where people sort of contributed their own thoughts and perspectives, and that's been really interesting. And then the second thing is I also maintain a very, very simply coded, like this is just what it looks like, it's just like a static page, website of open access mechanics data sets. So if you have a data set that you would like me to advertise on that website, shoot me an email. I'm super happy to do it. And if this is a useful resource for you, maybe you want to use some of this for your research or you're teaching a class, something like that, go for it. It's a resource for the community. So that's what I wanted to say about promoting open science in the mechanics community. The final thing I want to talk about in my last 10 minutes is some of our more recent kind of ongoing, unpublished, but hopefully within the next couple weeks, soon to be submitted work that is sort of taking all of what we've learned from this work, working on benchmarks, and trying to kind of bring it to the next level. So this is sort of this more or less sums up the kind of more sophisticated benchmark that my group has been working on over the past couple of years. We have 1,000 initial crack patterns, 2 different types of boundary conditions, and then 3 different energy decomposition splits within the phase field fracture framework. So 6,000 simulations overall, where this is more or less the information that's getting put out. It's force versus displacement curves, full field displacements, and then damage patterns at the end. And it took us a while to really put together this data set and kind of get everything to a place where we felt really comfortable publishing it for a couple reasons. The first one is just that curating data takes work. I'm sure people who've done it sort of think about that a lot too. It takes time and effort. But then the other one was also when we were doing sort of simple benchmarks like uniaxial tension, shear, stuff like that, we actually had a lot of trouble reproducing the results of others in the phase field fracture literature. And I think a lot of that is just because there are often little details that just don't get reported, but for problems that are highly nonlinear, it really makes a difference. So whether or not you define an initial crack as a damaged field or in your mesh, that leads to different outcomes potentially if you have these very sensitive problems. And it just took us a really long time to kind of put together things and come up with a code that we felt happy with. And I think that's again, another thing that I'm happy to talk about with people if they have expertise in phase field fracture and want to discuss. We also ended up implementing 3 different energy decomposition splits and disseminating, or we're about to disseminate all of those in our data set for a couple of reasons. I think the first one is that we just thought it was kind of interesting that sometimes they give different results. It's most obvious in the shear case. You have to sort of relax your eyes and look at these, but you can see, for example, here, that's fundamentally different than that, right? You're getting different crack patterns. So we thought that was just sort of interesting and worth kind of having in the mix. But we also thought that this was potentially the type of thing where perhaps a machine learning framework sitting on top of something like this could actually potentially be really impactful, right? We have this sort of class of numerical methods where the implementation details really matter. Perhaps rather than saying, my method is better than your method, there's actually a way to say, oh, let's use sort of a machine learning framework sitting on top of this world to get something a bit more meaningful. So that's just something I kind of want to put out into the universe. And then alongside this data set, we're also working on putting together a few kind of baseline models to go alongside it to sort of say hey, here's how just sort of implementing things goes. If you can do something better, that's probably meaningful. So there's a paper published recently called PDE Bench. And in that paper, they have pins, Fourier operators, and units as kind of baselines. So we just sort of went through all 3 of those. We started with the standard implementation of pins on these problems, and they didn't really work well, so it's not shown on this slide. And that's not surprising. It's kind of beyond the scope of what they're initially developed for. But then the thing that we thought was interesting was we have a 2024 paper, Phase Field Modeling of Fracture with Physics-Informed Deep Learning. And when we implemented it on these data, it just really didn't do well. And I don't think that that means that the method won't work. I think it just means that this is a more challenging problem than what this approach was tested on previously. And I'm excited to get sort of the data out into the world to see how people can improve upon these results. Similar kind of on Fourier neural operators. So this is a histogram of the F1 score of these across 5 different seeds. Overall mean definitely shows room for improvement. This right here is the worst example. This right here is the best example. So we have initial conditions, finite element analysis, ground truth, and then the red superimposed in the final column is the ground truth superimposed over what the machine learning model predicted. And again, you can see basically room for improvement here. UNets as well, also definitely room for improvement. They did a little bit better than the FNOs, but I will say when we implemented the initial units from the PDE bench paper, those actually did quite badly. This is, my student basically spent more time implementing the unit architecture. And again, these are just like baseline results. We're not trying to necessarily advertise one method over another. We're just saying this is sort of, we believe that if you can beat this performance, you're showing something meaningful. And then the final thing that we're planning to put out there is essentially summarized on this slide. And I think this is the thing that I'm kind of the most excited about, especially in conjunction with all the different energy decomposition methods and the way those potentially interrelate. And it's basically this idea that, is not, it's very much out there, but I think it's particularly interesting in some of these kind of fracture problems, because it's not necessarily straightforward what the best way to implement it is. But the idea is basically you can get quite large performance gains if you do ensemble averaging, and then the type of ensemble averaging you do actually really matters. And if you think back to the previous slides, best case and worst case sample shown right here, the ensemble stacking approach did pretty well, and I think that's a direction that would be really cool to explore in the future, especially given that we didn't invest a lot of time and effort into sort of tailoring loss functions and other metrics and stuff like that to the specific nature of the fracture problem. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement here, and it's something I think is pretty cool. And then finally, we have a survey that is very much open. If you want to give us feedback on our data sets and what we should be working on, I can't promise I'll listen to it, but I would absolutely love to know what it is. So we have in our heads, informed by a lot of conversations, and also in part by a workshop Assad organized a couple years ago, that there are some really exciting problems out there that would kind of motivate new methods development. And my guess at them is kind of material nonlinearity, maybe these fracture problems, geometric nonlinearity, some interesting large deformation and buckling. But I want to know what other people are interested in. So definitely, if you want to fill out the survey now, go for it. If you wake up tomorrow and want to fill out the survey, send me an email. I really appreciate learning what people think. And then basically, just to wrap things up, this slide's totally an aside, but we're working on kind of similar stuff in the tissue engineering space. But it's been very, very slow going, because before even being able to talk about like what is a benchmark or how we would benchmark something, there's this massive need to be able to actually even just define what a metric is, right? Like you have all these microscopy images. How do you turn those into numbers? What numbers do you pull out of them? And that's another topic that I'm super excited about and happy to have conversations with people if they're interested. And that's my talk. So yeah, look forward to any questions.
Are there any questions?
Thank you very much for your talk and your contribution to the community. I have a question about the utility of these benchmarks. They can serve, I think, the 2D, and basically my question is 2D versus 3D. So whom do we cater to? Who is our customer? Is it our customer, the developer, graduate students, first-year graduate student developers who like to have a nice benchmark pedagogical problem, and or are we cater to the industry who have three-dimensional problems? So, for example, it makes a big difference if you cannot use FNO for 3D problems because it explodes. UNet, the way you use it, actually, it's very simplistic because you can just do cross connections and attention blocks, and it will beat everybody. So there's like some sort of, one thing is the data 2D versus 3D, and who are you talking to? People who want to write papers or who want to solve problems? So that's my first question. The other one is what do we do using simplified models which are obsolete as opposed to somebody who is working now on a sophisticated, including Mishra that you talked about. They have C UNet or something like that. They basically do the UNet with decorations. So the questions on data and models.
Yeah, so I think with regard to data, that's an amazing question. And I think that one of the things that I've learned is that, when you're trying to sort of guess who your users are and you're working in the context of academia where everything is kind of amorphous, it's not necessarily straightforward. I've basically thought about two things. The first is the fact that if it's really hard to get your data onto people's computers or into their fingertips, no one's going to use it. So I've thought a lot about trying to develop benchmarks and data sets, and we've done this for a couple of examples, where there's almost like a light version that can come down onto someone's computer in a couple minutes and you can just get going with it. And then there's also a more complicated version for someone who's like a serious methods developer and kind of wants to get their hands dirty in that way. So that's one thing. Then I think the other thing is sort of tiers of challenge. So I will say in the grant that's supporting part of this fracture work, what you have here is basically like task 1. Task 2 is basically going to be to think about 3D architectures and how to do some of the modeling in that context. And I think that what we're trying to do is satisfy a large group of people, primarily in academia. But I think sort of this eye towards industry and the need for more stuff that kind of breaks the simplicity of just borrowing from computer vision is very much in my head. Did that answer your question? Yes. Sort of. And then to your second point, you're talking about what is kind of an outdated model. I think this field moves so fast that something that showed up 2 or 3 years ago at this point feels outdated. I would say that is actually not the question that keeps me up at night. My focus has really been on the data sets, creating and disseminating the data sets, and thinking about ways to enable comparisons. And I think all of the models that I'm showing today, I think that they should be beaten. Like they're sort of like, this is maybe what a standard user would do. I'd like to see things that are better.
Maybe let's have Asad already be able to set up, and Horacio with the question.
Thank you. I have a question about the fracture. All the problems that you discuss on fracture are 2D. What are the complexities in applying these ideas to 3D?
Yeah, so when it comes to sort of like the data dissemination perspective, I think that, moving phase field fracture from 2D to 3D, people have done it. It's hard, it's computationally intensive, but that is doable. I think on my end, the thing that's going to be challenging, or the most challenging about doing this in 3D, is actually just figuring out a good and thoughtful way to make that size data available to people. It's going to be like gigabytes and gigabytes of data, and if we want to think about doing something on the scale where it's maybe like 1,000 or 6,000 simulations, doing that in a thoughtful way that's genuinely accessible to people is something we're really trying to be thoughtful about, but don't have a clean answer for.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker one more time.